Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sama sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sama sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sama sambuddhassa. What I would like to talk about this evening is the Buddhist teaching of anatta, not self. This is one of the most important central teachings of the Buddha, and it's the teaching which is especially unique to the Buddha. In the context of India, the teaching of anatta is not found in any of the other schools outside of Buddhism, and every variation of Buddhism has adopted this teaching. So it's a central defining characteristic of Buddhist teaching is this idea of not self. It's a teaching that is subtle, and initially, at initial approach to it, it seems counterintuitive. People find it puzzling or even sometimes frightening. It goes against our implicit assumptions. The Buddhist teaching is the idea of a self is an illusion. It's a mental construction that has no substantial reality. It's at best, it's a conventional construction with some utilitarian function in the world, but it's not a metaphysical or ontological reality. It's called the anatta, not self, and the name is referencing to a common philosophical concept in India prior to the Buddha was that of the atta, or in Sanskrit Atman, which we find in the Upanishads, for example, a lot of talk about the Atman. This was believed to be a essence of a person, imperishable, unchanging, the most real part of a person is the Atman. So it's kind of close to the Western idea of a soul. It's a similar concept. In the Bhagavad Gita, which is a Hindu text somewhat later than the Buddha's time, the Atman is described as that which transmigrates from life to life. And it said when a person is reborn, it's like a man waking up in the morning and putting on a fresh suit of clothes. The Atman assumes a new body and carries on. So this was a radical departure for the Buddha to teach this doctrine of the insubstantiality. The concept of anatta is a special case of the more general teaching of sunya or sunyata, the emptiness of all things, the voidness. And this too is a little difficult to approach at first encounter. But the idea underlying it is that there are in the world, in any level of the cosmos, there are no substantial self-existent entities persistent in time. One way that I've heard this phrase, and I really like the phrase, is nothing exists from its own side. So there are at least two ways to approach this concept of emptiness or not self intellectually. One is the method of analysis, and the other we could call the method of synthesis. Method of analysis is to look closer and closer at the operation of body-mind and not finding anywhere a substantial essence. There's the Zen story about, or koan, about the man searching for the owner of the empty house and not finding him, and then asking who is doing the looking. In the Theravada scriptures, the late text, the questions of King Milinda, there is much discussion about anatta. Questions of King Milinda is a very interesting document. It's a very early encounter of East and West. Milinda, or his Greek name was Menander, was a king of the Greek kingdom in Bactria, which is Afghanistan, Pakistan area. It was one of the remnants of Alexander's empire. So he was trained, Menander was trained in Greek thought and philosophy, and he was interested in the teachings of the East. And he had this encounter with the monk Nagasena, and is recorded in the Questions of King Milinda. The classic expression of not self here is Milinda's chariot. Nagasena asked the king, "How did you arrive to this meeting today?" And the king said, "I came in my chariot." And Nagasena said, "Well, O king, if we were to tear apart this chariot and put the axle here and the wheels there and the backboard here and the front board there and so on, could you show me in this pile of parts where is the essence of chariot?" And the king said, "No, there's no such thing. There's no essence of chariot." And there was some more Socratic style back and forth question and answer, and he gets the king to define chariot as nothing more than a name, a convention, that which we call this pile of parts. If they're arranged properly, then we can call it a chariot, but there's no particular essence of chariot. So Nagasena says, so it is with the human being. There is just this body, feelings, mental formations, perceptions, and consciousness. That is the five khandhas. And when these are arranged in a certain way and functioning properly, we can say, here is Nagasena, here is Milinda. But these are just names, conventions, designations. So with a closer examination of body and mind, we don't find anywhere an abiding self or an essence. And this is the experience of insight meditation or vipassana. When we examine what's happening at any given moment, what we find is at this moment there is just an object and consciousness arising to the object, and no third besides. That is, no self. There's nobody doing it, and there's no persistence or substantiality in any of these objects or in the consciousness knowing the object. It's just a process. And the more we examine, the closer we look, we never find anything we can substantially call me. All there is body, perceptions, consciousness, feelings, and mental formations. The idea of a self is in this way an entirely unnecessary and redundant concept. It explains nothing. It has no explanatory value. To understand what I mean by this, let's update the simile of Melinda's chariot and talk about Melinda's Chevrolet. So there's a man has just bought a new car and he's real happy and proud of it. But he doesn't know the first thing about auto mechanics. He doesn't know how a car works. He's completely ignorant about that. So he's come up with the theory that there's a green goblin that lives under the hood that makes everything go. And let's call this man Melinda, and he's got a friend, his buddy Nagasena, who is a Class A mechanic. And he tells him his green goblin theory, and he says, "You're crazy. There's no green goblin in the car." "Well, what makes the wheels go round?" "It's the turning of the crankshaft." "Okay, well, the green goblin's in there turning the crankshaft around." No, that's the energy imparted by the pistons firing in the cylinders that causes the crankshaft to turn. "Well, then the pistons are moved up and down by the green goblin." No, that's a spark plug exploding the gas. "Well, then the energy to the spark plug is given to the spark plugs by the green goblin." No, that comes from the distributor cap. You go on and on and on, and in the end you can explain every detail of the operation of an automobile without any reference to a green goblin. It becomes completely unnecessary. It's only inserted at the beginning when you have no proper understanding of how things work. And you just have to make something up. So until we examine the nature of body and mind, we assume there's a self doing stuff. And when we look for it, we don't find it. We find only the operation of body and mind. And when we look at a finer and finer grain, which we should be doing in Vipassana meditation, we're looking at momentary occurrences of consciousness and processes of body and mind. We see that it's impersonal. We see nobody's home, nobody's doing it. There's just these various processes that can be reduced to momentary flashes. So that's what I would call the method of analysis, looking at a more microscopic level, a fine grain of reality, moment by moment. Another way to approach the idea of not-self is through the relationship of things. This is the method of the dependent origination. To understand that things are conditioned and they're only the result of cause and effect of other things. So that reality becomes a dynamic interplay of forces. And what we think of as substantial entities are just momentary intersections of forces. And nothing exists independent of other things. So there's no substantial standalone entity anywhere. They're just nodes in this constantly changing, flickering network of forces. There's no substantiality anywhere, no persistence anywhere. So these are two ways of approaching an understanding of not-self with the intellect. And we can get closer and closer to a understanding of this idea, something like a mathematical asymptote that gets closer and closer to zero but never reaches zero. The actual full understanding of not-self is only possible by direct realization, and it only occurs completely at the moment of stream entry. And even then, there is only a partial dismantling of the idea of self. This is one reason why the idea or concept of a self is so persistent and so difficult to shake off, to penetrate, is that it's multi-layered. And we can identify at least 3 layers of self-making in the mind. And the first one, the most superficial one, and initially the dominant one in the mind, because it's superficial, it's kind of the noisiest, is Sakaya Ditti, which is usually translated personality view. A more literal translation would be own body view. Body not necessarily meaning the physical body. Kaya can mean any kind of organized structure, so that includes the mental body as well. Sakaya Ditti. This is the concept of self at the level of view or Ditti. So to understand what is meant here, we need to consider what is meant by a Ditti. It's translated view, which is pretty reasonable translation, but it's not to be considered merely as an opinion. It's deeper than that. We could say your opinions arise out of your Ditti. Ditti is the way we hold our understanding of the world. It's the underlying assumption. It's close to the philosophical concept in the West from German Weltanschauung, worldview. It's kind of like that. And it's very important. Ditti is Samadhitti, right view, is the first step of the Eightfold Path. And the view we hold of things colors everything else. It sets the background of all our thinking and emoting and understanding. We can have Samadhitti, right view, or Micchaditti, false view. And Sakaya Ditti, own body view, is one type of Micchaditti, or false view. So it's a assumption, an underlying implicit idea in the mind that there is a self. There is a me, a mine, and also other selves, you and yours. And, the idea of substantial entities as being a metaphysical reality. This is Sakaya Ditti, the own body view. And as said, it's only fully overcome at the moment of stream entry. Stream entry is the first of 4 stages of awakening. It is the first glimpse of Nibbana, or the unconditioned. It's like the curtains part for a moment and the mind goes, oh, and it changes everything. It's a turning around in the depth of the being. And having glimpsed the unconditioned, this throws the conditioned, or the ordinary world, into a new light. It's understood for the first time, as it were, from the outside. It's like a fish cannot fully understand water, but a turtle that can travel in the water or on the land has a better understanding of water. So stream entry is also called the opening of the Dhamma eye, because it's the purification of view. And that from that moment on, the person has a purified view, which doesn't mean they have full understanding of everything. It's far cry from that, but their view is no longer corrupted by Micchaditti, false view, so they can't fall into personality view or eternalism or annihilationism. And the Sakaya Ditti is ended for once and all. But having overcome Sakaya Ditti, there are still at least 2 deeper levels of self-making that remain. The intermediate level is self based on desire. And this is explained in the formula of the dependent origination. We have the 12 stages of the dependent origination, and the particular section of that deals with self-making begins with sense contact. When a being makes sense contact with the eyes, ears, nose, body, or tongue, there arises feeling. Is the next stage. Feeling is the emotive response that immediately occurs upon sense contact, which is felt as pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral. And because of feeling, there arises craving in the mind. And craving is always directed towards feeling. We want happy feeling and we want to escape from unpleasant feeling. And we're just bored by neutral feeling. And so this craving then is a movement of the mind, and this is the beginning of the problem. Feeling is resultant. It happens irregardless, and it's ethically neutral. Pain and pleasure are just feelings that arise in the mind. They have no, and it's not something we can have any control over. It's just a result of sense contact. But then if we succumb to the craving for feelings, then the mind moves on to the next stage, which is upadana, or clinging. More literally, it's fuel for becoming. And with clinging, the craving is elaborated and becomes more complex. Craving itself is just a very simple impulse of the mind, and you can't really say there's a self at that point. But we start to create a self with clinging, because instead of just a raw impulse of I want this, now it's how am I going to get it? What do I have to do? And the mind starts to make a project out of the craving, and comes into a duality and a relationship of self and other. Because if there's going to be a possessed object, there must be a possessor. And this leads to becoming. A self is now constructed in the mind as a holder for all this activity. And whenever a self is created, it then leads to birth, old age, sickness, and death, or, in short, suffering. So by creating a self, we create something to suffer. Now this type of self is not the first type of self. Sakkaya Ditthi is on that cognitive level, we could say, the level of understanding. This is at a deeper kind of emotive or appetitive level, that there's an impulse of me and mine and other, the desired or repelled object. So even a stream winner can fall into this kind of selfing, which we could call kind of selfishness. It's possible even for a sotapanna to maybe take the last cookie off the tray, because although he or she has no concept of a self as any kind of reality, he or she still wants that cookie for me. Right? This is an entirely different level. Right? And this is the aspect of sensual desire underlies this. That's weakened by the second stage of awakening, and is only transcended or eliminated on the third stage, the anagami. The anagami is a person who is very close to full awakening, and it's only then that sensual desire is fully overcome. But even an anagami still remains some subtle defilements, the 5 deeper, or sometimes they're called higher defilements, of desire for material becoming, for immaterial becoming, restlessness, the I am conceit, and ignorance. And the one relevant to this discussion about self-making is the I am conceit, asmi mana. This is the subtlest level of self-making, and it's obscure at first. When we first encounter this in the scriptures, it's difficult to see the difference between this and Sakaya Ditti. But the key difference is that asmi mana, the I am conceit, is based not on the cognitive level or the emotive level. It's based on perception, sanya. It's a false perception of the world as having a privileged point of view. So we should make a small digression here and talk a little bit about what is meant by perception, because this is quite important for understanding a lot of the Buddhist teaching, is to know the difference between consciousness and perception. These two faculties operate very closely together, very intertwined, so much so that in our ordinary experience we don't really separate them. But they are quite distinct, and it's possible to begin to notice the difference if the mind is clear enough. Consciousness, or vijnana, is the simple experiencing of things through the senses, the pure knowing not in the sense of understanding, but of experiencing. It operates through the senses, and it's the way we take in information from the outside world, and is limited in practice by the physical organs of sense. So, for example, to take the eye sense, Chakku Vijnana, eye consciousness, this experiences only a limited, to use modern language, it uses only a limited bandwidth of electromagnetic radiation that we call visible light. It's a very narrow sliver of the total electromagnetic spectrum. The ear sense knows only vibrations in the air, and it's a limited range of frequencies at that. And there are other organisms that have different ranges. We know that dogs can hear sounds that we can't hear. There are insects like bees that can perceive higher frequencies than what we call visible light. And they can discern at least 2 additional colors beyond the violet that we can't even conceive of. We can't imagine what they look like. But the bees can distinguish these frequencies, so they must have some subjective impression of these colors. So we get these limited signals from the outer world, and that's all consciousness deals with. So eye consciousness does not see a table, a chair, a dog, a man, a tree. All eye consciousness sees is color and shape. It doesn't hear voices or musical notes or cars going by. It only hears different frequencies and amplitudes of sound. So it's just a raw information. And then perception takes that raw information and creates or simulates a world out of it. So the world we actually experience and live in is not directly the outer world. It is a simulation that we create with perception. And there has been, in Buddhist history, there have been schools of thought, like the Yogacara school of India, that held there is no outer world. The only reality is mind, and we just create a world with our mind. The Theravada position, as I understand it, is not that extreme. It holds that there is some outer reality, but it's sort of a moot point. It's not worth thinking about it too much because we can never actually touch it. We can never actually know it directly. All we know is this limited signals coming in through the senses, and then perception creates a simulation that we can operate in. And if the faculties are in good order, if we're not delusional, then this simulation is close enough to any outer reality that we can function. We can manipulate objects, and we can move around, and it works. But we can see also that perception has a creative aspect, and it's not 100% reliable, and it's somewhat fluid. A good example of this that I think everyone can relate to, at some point, pretty much everybody has been relaxing out of doors, lying on your back, looking at the clouds, and letting your mind play. And you see faces and shapes and animals and things in the clouds. And if you keep it up for a while, they can become very detailed and particular. You can do the same thing with flames in an open fire. I'm sure everybody can relate to this. And this is perception that's been let loose and allowed to play. It's taking the same sense data, but is no longer trying to create a realistic simulation, but is now just making stuff up. And this is even more so when we're dreaming at night. Then perception is entirely off the leash, and it's creating a world that, while we're in it, it seems very real, but it's not constrained by senses. It's creating this world out of nothing more than fragments of memory and imagination. That's the quality of perception. And that same perception is operating when we're awake, but most of the time it's fairly tightly constrained by the signals coming in from the outer world. So we can see with these examples that perception can be, does have a creative aspect and can sometimes be unreliable. And to return to the theme of asmimana, the I am conceit, this is a delusion of perception. And in that the world is perceived wrongly by being organized around a principle of a privileged position. This here is the center of the universe. Right? That's the perception of I am conceit. And it's very subtle. It operates on a subtle level. It's not something, if you ask someone who's not totally delusional, are you the center of the universe? They say, no, of course not. But they're perceiving the world that way. It's kind of a natural way to perceive it because our organs of sense are clustered in one close proximity, mostly around the head. So we kind of perceive the center of the universe. But it's a false perception. And that's operating, as I said, on a very subtle level. So we don't really notice it. And it's only overcome by the Arahant. The way to begin unraveling this is to begin to understand perception and not to believe your perceptions as ultimate reality. This is the error that in philosophic terms they call naive realism. That you naively assume what you cognize and perceive to be ultimately real. Once you begin to understand perception, you can begin to loosen this deepest level of I am making. So there are these various ways of creating a self, and it's really a central part of the spiritual project is unraveling these illusions of self and beginning to approach this emptiness, this idea of voidness or emptiness, which the more it's taken on, the more you can get a taste or glimpse of emptiness, the more liberating it is. It's a very liberating experience. It overcomes a great deal of suffering. And the less sense of self one has, the less fear and anxiety one has. The Buddha, in discussion with the Brahmin students, was asked by Mogaraja, one of the 16 Brahmin students, he asked, how can I escape from the gaze of the Lord of Death? And the Buddha's answer was three things. He said, be ever mindful, see the world as empty, and abandon thoughts of self. So being ever mindful is the first thing, is to be awake, to be conscious, to directly experience and see clearly. See the world as empty is the external sense of shunya, or emptiness. To see the voidness of all things, not to believe in substantiality of discrete objects. To see through that illusion. And abandon thoughts of self is to give up this self-reference at any level. So the internal emptiness, or anatta, not self. And one final reflection about the not-self teaching is that this teaching of emptiness is the most universal factor. So you have the three characteristics of impermanence, suffering, and not-self that apply to all sankharas, all conditioned things. But the teaching of emptiness also applies to all dhammas, so all phenomena whatsoever. So it applies also to the conditioned and the unconditioned. So the samsaric world is empty and nibbana is empty. It's all void. So void is the most universal characteristic. So I'll stop and can answer a few questions if you like, and carry on.